Joining me to discuss how this pension and Social Security is working or not working is Josh Rauh. He's a finance professor at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He's also a senior fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Welcome to the show. Good to see you, Professor. Let me start with this. So how do we grade these systems? What's the definition of it working or not working?
Well, thanks very much for having me on the show. That's a great question to start us off. The first criterion is really how adequate the system is at providing retirement benefits and replacing income. So when you retire, what portion of your late career earnings is replaced by the system? Second criterion is it sustainable? You know, we could replace a big portion of lifetime income through public systems, but it would be unsustainable. And the third is how well is the system governed? Is the money that people are putting into the system being efficiently put to use and being returned to them in retirement with a reasonable return?
The benefits itself. A lot of people talk about how the individual needs to come up with some of the money. Some people say the companies should come up with some of the money. Others say the government should have a larger proportion in terms of ensuring there's a social safety net for individuals. Who's ultimately most responsible, or is the answer perhaps a combination of all three, and how do you divide up the responsibility?
Well, look, the basic problem around the world is that there have been huge demographic shifts. People are living longer, birth rates are declining. That's happening in pretty much every major country of the world. And when that happens, there are really only two possible solutions. One is people or the system at large has to save more. More resources have to be devoted. And the second is that people have got to work longer. And there's a realization of that in most of the major countries of the world. However, a lot of the governments around the world are just struggling under the burden of their systems, which, as you pointed out, were set up maybe 80 years ago. And they were set up at times when life expectancies were just much lower. And many countries now are facing these demographic bulges where ever-shrinking numbers of working people are having to support the retirements of ever-growing numbers of retirees. So to answer your question, what I think has to happen is the government systems have got to reform and have got to be consistent with the kinds of statistics that we see now in terms of life expectancies and personal behavior. And at the same time, individuals have got to be encouraged to save more, because without that, there's just no way that people are going to be able to replace a reasonable amount of their lifetime income in retirement.
I recently hosted a fairly large panel discussion regarding aging, and a lot of questions surrounded China in particular. They are making very big decisions and inroads in terms of reforming. I mean, there's a lot more to do, but one of the big problems that I think a lot of us didn't quite understand was there simply aren't enough young people to replace the ones that are getting older. I won't go into the details. You know what I'm talking about. So I guess my question to you is, what's working and what's not working in China?
Well, what has been working well lately is a couple of reforms that have been trying to unify the pension system to sort of give everybody more of an equal deal. And one of the most interesting recent ones has been the proposal that is now going to be put into place that public sector workers should really have the same kind of deal that the urban private sector workers have, which is to say that the employer, the state, will put in 20% of pay, and the employee will then put 8% of pay into a defined contribution plan. Moving the private and the public sector together, that civil service sector, and moving it closer to the private sector, that's something that it's very interesting to see China undertaking. In the U.S., if anything, we have a major and increasing divergence as the private sector moves more towards individual responsibility, private savings accounts, and the public sector is still very much in the past, living on essentially unsustainable government-provided defined benefit pension systems. So that's been working well. What hasn't been working well is when, in some cases, the local governments of China have diverted those 8% of pay contributions that are really supposed to go into individual retirement accounts. They have, in some instances, diverted them to help pay for the state pension. And that has also happened in some other countries, including Russia. And that simply can't happen, because that then takes the wind out of the sails of individuals being given the incentive to save for their own retirement.
Josh, you are young. We all are young still. But if we were close to retirement, which country would we want to retire in and why?
Well, I think the answer to that question is pretty clear. I would say either Denmark or Australia. If you look at the countries that have really good systems, they have the following features. First of all, there is a low but stable base pension so that even if you're poor, you're going to get something. You're going to be able to live. That's very important. These countries then have systems where individuals have been usually required to save for retirement in private savings accounts where there are good savings and investment options. And where those requirements have been put in place with enough lag time and have worked, people have been able to build up very substantial resources to be able to retire. And then in addition, there's usually some means-tested government program that has been put on a path to sustainability by reforms over time. So I would say usually the winners in those categories are countries like Denmark, Australia, and the Netherlands. Those would be the ones.
All right, you hear that, business team? Those are the places we want to retire in. All right, Josh.